I think what games have opened for regular people is the ability to think differently about things, whether it's thinking different about the way that they solve problems, whether it's thinking differently about being more open to different approaches for things. I think what games are about is choice.
Games are fundamentally different in that there is a consistency in the creation, maybe to a 75%, and then you kind of hand over what happens to the player. Yes, you're always going to start at point A, you're always going to end at point B, but there's still something unique that happens in the process of getting there. And that starts to make the sharing of the experience all the more valuable.
There's a lot of different areas that can be explored, and a lot of different concepts that can be explored, I think, through the use of technology. I mean, it's just all about that communication, and whether it be through time or through a still painting that the viewer has to examine and relate to and spend their own time in contemplating the meaning or whatever it is the artist wants to communicate.
I feel like we're at the early majority of convincing people. I don't think anybody in the industry would question that. But certainly when you look at the more artistic experiences that you see, things that even minimize gameplay and just give you that ethereal, explorative feel, I hope that more people get exposed to that, and that changes their experience of games.
How would I explain video games to a person like Leonardo da Vinci or Leonardo da Vinci? Okay. Leonardo da Vinci kind of pioneered, it's a technique, he pioneered photography because it's thought that he used a technique of pinhole cameras to paint some of his works. So he was on the cutting edge of technology of his day, and he came up with all sorts of ideas for flying machines, way before anybody ever thought that could be possible.
He created, more than just beautiful works of art. He created, machines, helicopters, flying machines. You did so much more than that.
Well, that'd be kind of challenging because he didn't even see television. If he hadn't seen TV in the first place, he couldn't have thought of that next thing. So it's kind of a gradual step. I guess would be dependent on how much he was willing to look into it and learn. Whether was he scared of it or would he be fascinated by it?
I'm not sure how I could really explain it to him other than to have him play it and experience it for himself.
I would say interactive moving stories. Because it would be the same thing as explaining what a television is, like what a projection is. Because 9 times out of 10, I would say at all times there's some kind of story, to the video game, whether it be just in the context of what you're doing in the game or kind of what it means to you. It's like an ongoing thing. Rather than try to explain it, I would try to actually show him. The trick would be getting him to pick up a joystick and giving it a try with an open mind. And I didn't know the guy personally, so I don't know if he had an open mind or not. I would think he would, but I don't know. We might have like a Bill and Ted's moment there. Maybe they'd be scared of it, and maybe they'd embrace it.
The whole challenge with games as art is the fact that it isn't a static creation. You know, there is some performance art that's out there. There is some of the more oblique sort of works, be it an installation or otherwise, that does kind of have an unstable quality that the viewer will see something different depending on, say, the time of day or the location that it's been placed in. But for the most part, because it is static, books, paintings, movies, everyone can get their head wrapped around that. With games, the idea that the player, that the consumer has so much agency in the completion of the finished work really raises some fascinating and I think sometimes undermining aspects to whether or not a video game can function as art.
Art to me is all about the artist communicating to the viewer through a medium of some sort. It's relating and communicating through a visual or, auditory or some other medium. Video games, they're a kind of combination of a bunch of different art forms together, because you have the visual side, you have the audio side, which a lot of people may not think about all the time, but there's a lot of audio work that goes into it, and then there's the programming side, which is not necessarily considered art by most, but it is a big part of the video. It's the main part of the video game experience, I'd say. When you only have the visual surface to communicate, it takes a lot of different considerations, I guess, communicating with the viewer through the medium.
That's one of those things that I do think about a lot. It's like, why do I go grab cans of spray paint and paint 8-bit images on walls? Like, I'm still trying to figure out where that's something is in me that this is what I want to do, and it's like if I don't do it, I get frustrated. Like it's not depression, but I feel like there's a blockage. Like I have to go do some stuff like this, and then I see it, and I'm just like, yes, it's as amazing as I thought it was going to be in my head. And I don't know why I'm like that. I don't know what got me into graffiti. I don't know what got me into street art. I don't know what got me into video games. But there's just an equal love for the two art forms, the two mediums. Like, there's something about video games and there's something about graffiti that really appeals to me.
Games are great because they're interactive. Like, they're the one form of media and entertainment that you actually get to be a part of. Like, you get to make decisions and choices, and I think that's great. So on one hand, just the interactivity is the art form, but based on what I do, I love making a beautiful game. Like, I love playing beautiful games. Like, I play terrible games just because they're pretty, and I'll run around and like look at stuff, and games take me twice as long as my friends to play because I'll just run around, like stare at the ground and try to figure out how they did stuff. And so art and games to me is kind of the whole package, but in different ways.
Video games can engage a player with audio, visuals, but then this new quality that's unique to video games themselves, which is interactivity. And that can mean a few different things, I think, depending on who you ask and the game that you're talking about. The interactivity or lack thereof in a narrative-based game can cause the player to empathize with a character that maybe they wouldn't in any other medium. And it's interesting because I think we're at a moment in time right now where that's really at the crux of the conversation, I think, of the relevance of video games as a communicative medium.
It's the communication and expression and making the viewer think. It's not just an experience. It's not just an experience for the viewer, like tactily, or a journey necessarily. It's making the viewer think about concepts and issues that they might not have necessarily thought before, making them see another side of an issue.
I do like the idea of being able to separate out, of if a creator, if a movie director, if an author, like, has a point that they're trying to get at. And they're making this creative work because they feel like they're trying to get at something about the human condition or show us something interesting about ourselves, then that is maybe closer to the definition of art that I feel most comfortable with, even though, again, I'm kind of a squish on this. I think when you look at something like Papers, Please, that was something that for me really kind of gave me that sensation of this experience from the other side, and having this sort of cheerless functionary, examine all of your belongings and ask you personal questions. And so Papers, Please, by putting you on the other side of that and putting you in this situation, imagine being the other guy, that TSA agent who constantly has to root through people's underwear because the one time you decide you're not going to root through people's underwear, that's the guy who has a bomb. And all hell is going to come crashing down on you. That is what Papers, Please kind of was for me. It was being able to empathize with somebody else. I look at that and I think, if that's not art, if that's not accomplishing what art is setting out to do, I don't really know what is.
I feel that art is all around us. Art is inherent to the viewer. Art is whatever someone decides to make of it. I mean, I think there's beauty in words, there's art, there's expression, and I think video games are much different than other mediums. You have movies and people, how many times have you heard the movie wasn't as good as the book? Or, HBO basically turns every great story into a mini-series. It's art imitating art. And video games, by and large, kind of, are their very own thing.
A lot of people compare it to film. And video games are not the same as film. Film is very linear. And with a game, you can go so many different paths. A player will not have the same thought process, be it today, be it tomorrow. And it's you're going down a corridor, but you might kind of creep on the side, check out this floor texture, whatever. And you don't really get that in a movie. In a movie, you're just watching it. But in games, you're being immersed.
Games are art like our movies art. I think that there are movies that are art and there's movies that aren't art. I think there are games that are art and there's games that are not art. And I think just like the movie industry, in which the movie industry kind of ebbs and flows from super blockbusters to now indies are super cool, and then blockbusters again, and then indies again. And it's this constant back and forth. I think games are very similar.
Have you thought about this?
There are a lot of games that don't really want to be art. And I think, when you're saying are video games art, it's are movies art? There are a lot of movies that don't want to be these, sort of incredibly memorable, moving, emotional, artistic masterpieces. They're a straight-ahead thriller, and it's totally fine for people to want those things. I think with the question of video games as art, we kind of get, a lot of that gets lost in the sense of all video games have to be first and foremost artistic expressions. And, there are some games that can be, just as there are some movies that can be.
It's if all movies in the beginning were just Stallone, we probably would be having the same discussion. But I think there are certain qualities to the medium that allowed Napoleon, the great silent film, or something like Nosferatu, even early on, to start to see where the technique and where the interest could lie and still be entertaining. And even with games that are still within genre, like Last of Us, that there's something more going on there. You have characters that aren't cookie cutter anymore. You have ways of playing with the medium and where it benefits, narrative. You have something like Mass Effect with branching paths. These are all very, very high concept and are tough to actually explain to someone without allowing them to play. And that really might be where the biggest challenge lies, is it's very hard to make the case that games are art if you're making it to someone that doesn't play games.
I think a part of it is because, take chess. Is chess a game or is chess art? I don't know. I can't even answer that question. And so I think a lot of people, when they look at, is Candy Crush. When you have something like Candy Crush and then you have Gone Home. Gone Home is potentially art. Candy Crush is not art. But to the general populace, they both very much squeeze them down. They are games. Because the people who see Candy Crush and just consider it's just a little thing to play with will never play Gone Home. Well, there's probably more of a chance that people sort of in their lives who will watch Transformers, and I hate to say Transformers isn't art, but I wouldn't say it is. You know, a ton of people will say Transformers, but they have more of a chance of seeing an indie movie that is maybe more considered to be art. Where I think games, there's much more of an active engagement. I have to go up on Steam and buy this game that I've heard is art, and then I can experience it as art. So I think it's a long and hard road for the general populace to ever really think of games as art, because to them, games are Candy Crush.
I almost feel bad like relating, video games to another medium, because I feel that video games needs to be taken seriously for its own medium. But it's the same thing as saying, can the Mona Lisa be compared to Mona Lisa's smile? It's a movie. It's compared to a work of art, which is hundreds and hundreds of years old. We live in a society where like most people who appreciate the Mona Lisa just appreciate the Mona Lisa because it's the Mona Lisa. It's don't get me wrong, the Mona Lisa is obviously beautiful and it's an art form that's kind of died out because physical paint and things like that have evolved. Not to take anything away from the Mona Lisa or what it means to people, because that's what it means to them, but I feel it's very apples and oranges, so it's kind of unfair to compare because it's not the same thing. I think there's a stigma behind video games where a lot of people who aren't into video games just see just one small fraction of video games. But again, this is just all perspective, right?
It's like somebody who's really into music and asking them if music is art. It's like, why would you even ask that question? It doesn't make any sense. To people who are outside that gaming space or don't have that perspective, I guess the question is still being asked, but as more and more people are kind of finding themselves gaming, whether they consider themselves a gamer or not, I think that over time the question is just going to go away. Especially as you see more and more of these offerings like Monument Valley coming out, where it's so obviously a mixture of gameplay experience and art that it's not really debatable anymore.
I think they've demonstrated artistic qualities and possibility that there are enough people who are interested in expressing themselves through the medium of video games that there's no question that it's art, in my mind, because that's the definition of art fundamentally, is that you are communicating an idea to someone or a group of people.
A lot of people just don't think that there's a lot of effort that goes into this, or they just aren't even aware. Maybe it's purely ignorant that they just don't know that it takes hundreds or thousands of people to make a next-gen title, or it takes one or two guys a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in their garage or their basement or a Starbucks somewhere just busting their butt to make something that's actually expressing what they feel that they want to get across to an audience.
To the wee hours of the morning. Not just yet.
Almost there.
I think that's the hurdle, is just showing people the creative side. I think in other mediums, we know who music composers are. We see actors on TV. That's easier to see. But the game is almost a reflection and you don't see the artist. It's almost more like a painting, I guess, except that painting is now completely socially acceptable and has been for thousands of years, I guess. And video games just are new and we're not quite there yet.
Video games in particular really did kind of come out of nowhere. I think Pong sort of set us on a nice commercial path, but there was definitely a period in the early days, even as late as the mid-'80s, early '90s, where no one was paying attention. We were kind of like B-movies in classic Hollywood, where you could get away with murder because no one cared. You weren't spending a lot of money, not a lot of people paid attention. And that allowed some crazy experimentation. 1979, I'll never forget it. I went over to a friend's house for a party, and instead of seeing a party at this guy's house, I saw 20 people, all of my adult friends, sitting around the biggest TV any of us had ever seen, a 25-inch television, and everybody was playing a game called Star Raiders, which was if not the first, then certainly one of the first-person real-time 3D games ever. And that was the moment where I realized that video games could not just be fun ways to waste some time, but they could actually put you in another world and make you believe you were there.
I feel like earlier on, games required a much tighter sense of vision in order to make them happen. I mean, the constraints that you were put under in terms of technology were so confining that you had to be really, really creative to be able to find the fun within that small box.
That's not easy. To express something that minimally is really hard to do, and sometimes people don't realize that. If you go back and look at art in the 20s, where they kind of went back to minimalism, 4 colors, real basic designs, but the impact you could get from the simplicity, I think, spoke volumes. And you can get a lot more across with something basic than you can with something, that's equally as complex. They both say something. It's just, I think I like saying it with, 3 or 4 colors.
I almost think some of the purest art are some of the earlier games, because they had a vision of what they could create. And you're hard-pressed to find one of the original game programmers that was looking at this as business first. They wanted to make something that was fun and challenging to play first. And so they had this grand idea, and then they're trying to execute it with the most primitive of code. But those games were awfully fun because of that. So the fact that they were able to create a vision which has no boundaries and squeeze it into this tiny amount of memory and still have it resemble their vision and still have it be a fun and enchanting game, especially for generations to come. Absolutely, there's an art form to that every bit as much as there is anything else.
If you look at Donkey Kong, right? If you talk to Shigeru Miyamoto and you read about his thought process when he was creating Donkey Kong, he started with those characters, and that was very weird at the time. His contemporaries were like, let's make a game where you shoot asteroids. Let's make a game where you eat dots. But you hear Miyamoto tell you about the story of the game, and he said, okay, there's a man, and then there's this girl, and then the man owns this monkey, but that this unnamed man that would kind of later become Mario, he mistreated the monkey. And so when Donkey Kong grabbed Mario's girlfriend and took off with her, we were supposed to be thinking that he wasn't this sort of black and white villain. He was this poor misunderstood creature. Meanwhile, the poor misunderstood creature is the enemy. He's the guy we're trying to knock out, and we're playing as Mario. You feel more sympathetic towards Donkey Kong than you do Mario. And I find that fascinating. I find that so interesting that that is where in 1981, that is where this guy's mind went when somebody asked him to make a video game.
I definitely think that the fact that no one was paying attention and we were alien to our culture helped us out a lot. In later years, when people did start paying attention, we got away from. There was a period of 10 or 20 years where things were very conservative because the stakes were so high.
And just as video games were getting really artistic and fun and weird, they started getting not weird, because weird started to become a lot less safe. It started to become very risky to be that weird. And we saw the AAA video games just get funneled down to really, right now, just this very small range of experiences that we can have. Meanwhile, the thing that saves video games is the democratization of development and the democratization of video game distribution.
We have this resurgence of sort of indie games, and you tie that to digital distribution through Steam and other channels, and it's given this power to indie developers to make their products and get them out and have people get access to them right away. There's no middleman. And so I think because of that, it's given all ranges of indie game developers, from the 2 or 3 person studios to the 140 person studios like us, access to get the ideas that we want, not filtered through a third party that may have different opinions about how our art should be used or changed or things like that. If you think back 20 years ago, most people would think almost everybody making games were indies, because they were all small teams. They were all just doing something nerdy to kind of make something that they themselves wanted to play and that their friends would play. And there was really no other sort of marketing or promotional or other kind of guidance. It was, I mean, even that's how, like, one of the games that I worked on was called Fallout. And Fallout is now seen as like this huge game and a huge brand and things like that. We were just making a cool game that was kind of like Road Warrior, and you could shoot stuff and there was mutant things, you know, and this weird 50s vibe. And, you know, and I think when it comes to indies now, indies are like everybody else was in some ways 20 years ago.
Just like the movies. Second floor, right? Yeah, and take a charger for the riot prod. We don't need another Anna Navarro shooting spree.
Like with Deus Ex, what I really wanted to do was take mechanics and make them part of the story. The whole goal, I mean, it's crazy to think about this, but one of the major goals, if not the whole goal of Deus Ex, was just to recreate that feeling I had when I played Dungeons & Dragons for the first time. That feeling of telling stories with other people, with someone else. And so for me, the magic of Deus Ex was that it was a real dialogue between the player and me and the team. It's a kind of an interesting narrative place to be, because the team owned the Aristotle. We owned the narrative arc and why what you were doing was important. But that minute-to-minute, step-by-step story, I did this and then I did this and then that happened and then, oh my God, did you believe it when that all belonged to the player. It was about presenting them with challenges that were part of a bigger story and saying, how are you going to solve this problem? And that, I think, was pretty innovative at the time.
Ultimately, in the end, you know, indies are doing a lot of what everybody was doing 20 years ago, but now they sort of have this group of people, a large enough group of people, that are really interested in them trying new things.
Games is a super weird medium. Like, we only just started out 30 years ago, you know? The people making the indie games back then are the guys running the AAA studios right now. I don't know if things are actually that different. I guess they are, because people are playing all these indie games now and next to those AAA games. So I think the contrast is more noticeable, you know? You can see Call of Duty and you can see something we've made. And that makes it more interesting, you know, something that there's varying degrees of interestingness.
I think it's this very symbiotic relationship between indies and gamers that are interested in what the indies are providing. I don't know if the gamers that existed 20 years ago would have been interested in, they would have like, that's interesting. Or maybe not, or why did I just pay $20 for this 2-hour thing, right? Gamers have broadened into a group that are interested, and because they've broadened, there's then a subsection of this group, and it's a large enough subsection that is interested in these sort of avant-garde things that indies make.
There's room now, not just for big budget AAA blockbusters put on discs and sold in stores. There's room for digitally distributed games like The Novelist and Thomas Was Alone. I mean, the Braid. Octodad. I mean, there's the range of content and the variety of games we're seeing now is what's really great about the indie scene.
The indie game makers, they don't have a bunch of suits worried about the bottom line and their stock price this quarter, trying to tell them what the game needs to do or try to trend in the market or have a long-term thing. They're just trying to make a game fun and trying to make a game meet their vision and take what's in their head and put it onto a screen. They're the closest thing to those early games that first hooked me when I was a kid, because you have a lot of parallels. You don't have large staffs, so it's kind of a throwback, and kind of at the same time a sign of how the industry has expanded.
The business term is democratization, which is kind of an irritating way to say it, but it's just, you know, can we make tools that are easier for people to use and at price points that are easier for them to buy, so that we can let people express their creativity instead of putting up kind of barriers for them to get into the medium.
The fact that we have so much better tools and that we have so many more different tools is terrific as a creator. that I now have a lot of different options where, 20 years ago, if I wanted to express an idea to, a programmer or an artist, maybe I would make some drawings or I would write up a document. And now, I can start in Maya, in a 3D modeling program, and make something, and then I can jump into Adobe After Effects and suddenly make this little movie, and then I can take that thing and then export it into a game engine and have it running in real time. At the end, there are all these tools that allow me to express what it is that I'm thinking about, which is helpful not only for communicating that, but also for me just to figure out what it is that I'm really excited about. So yeah, I think we're living in a golden age as far as finding off-the-shelf tools that pretty much do what we need to do.
Everyone who's a gamer could be a game maker if they decide to be. If you have the desire now, you've got the tools. And that's cool because there's so much creativity out among the entire group of the population that we're able now to tap into people we would have never gotten to because they wouldn't have had the tools or the access to also be creators. And I think that we've seen the same kind of thing happen in film and happen in audio that we're seeing in games, that suddenly the players or consumers can also become creators. And that's just a whole nother wave of human creativity being unleashed that we're going to benefit from over the coming generations.
When I look at sort of what the technology my children deal with on a day-to-day basis compared to me when I was their age, it's incredibly different. For me it was VCRs. VCRs were new things, and microwave ovens. That was hand and wireless phones, but no cell phones and things like that. And so technology, as it relates to how players deal, or how in essence the kind of things that players get to play and how they play them is dramatically different because of technology. I mean, when I was growing up, I had an Atari 2600 and a computer. That was it. There was nothing else. And the types of games and kind of what we could play were not huge. They weren't very varied, and there wasn't actually a lot of people making them at the time. Now when I look at my son, it's like a wealth of things that he can do. He has a computer, he has an iPad, he has my Android phones, there's a laptop by our TV. I mean, we have a Roku for streaming movies and stuff like that. He can play Angry Birds on it. It's amazing that I think really what technology has done, for people sort of embracing games is it's just made them so prevalent and easy to access. Plus this technology being cheaper to acquire, and so I think that's really changed the number of people and how people can embrace games through that sort of increase of technology.
Accessibility in all of its forms is what I see as being the issue. It's really tough. Now, I almost use the old kind of thing of saying it's tough to get my mom to play video games. My mom does play video games. Everybody's mom plays video games now. They play video games on Facebook. They play video games on their iPhone. Tons and tons of video games. Might not be the video games that you're playing. Might not be the video games that I'm playing, but they're playing video games.
I see a day where everybody plays games. Just like when you go to Japan and you ride the subway, you'll find people reading manga. You find people of all ages that enjoy anime. Traditionally, anything animated in the West is looked at as kids' fare. That's recently changed, especially certainly I think Pixar has had a lot to do with that. But as somebody that's grown up watching cartoons don't seem childish to me. I'm kind of an adult. I've also grown up playing video games, and video games don't seem childish to me at all. It seems like another form of entertainment, and I choose where I spend my entertainment time.
There's still this stigma that it's for young people, which is not true. I grew up playing video games. I can't tell you how many times I meet people who I talk about video games, and they're like, oh, I haven't played video games since Atari, or I used to have an Atari, or I used to have an NES. I'm like, I did too. I just didn't stop. I kept playing. It's always been a hobby of mine, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we need to stop that stigma. That needs to be just eliminated from our conversation.
As we age and as we bring up our children and bring them into the gaming culture, that this just becomes part of our everyday life, just as watching television or listening to your music on the bus or watching movies. Any of those things now are just part of everyday life. That's what I want to see.
Eventually, everyone will be a gamer. adults aren't stopping playing games. They start when they're kids for sure, and they keep playing into adulthood. I still play with my adult friends. My adult friends play with their kids now.
As a matter of fact, my mother-in-law, who is like 79 or 80 years old, she has played lots of video games over at my house and her house as well. She's completed Legend of Zelda like 5 or 6 times. She'll finish it, she'll start all over again. She loves that game. And she's the rare one right now because you can find plenty of 50 and 60-year-olds that say, I don't play games, I'm too old for that. And the reality is that's like saying, I don't read books, I'm too old for that, or I don't watch TV, I'm too old for that. It just depends on what content you're going to consume.
Comic books dealt with this an awful lot, and they still do today, even though some of the biggest movie blockbusters in recent times are all based on comic books. People didn't understand it. People that were looking at, traditional books, traditional literature, didn't understand that this colorful little flimsy magazine looking thing with cartoon characters in there could have deep characters and deep storyline as well. They dismissed it because they didn't even look at it. To me, video games have been quietly influencing all the other forms of pop culture for a long time.
In the 80s, Pac-Man took over everything, right? There was a single, Pac-Man Fever, played on the radio, and Pac-Man lunchboxes, everything from Pac-Man pajamas to Pac-Man thermoses and everything in between. I mean, Super Mario Brothers for Nintendo has done exceptionally well for itself, staying in the public consciousness and being a favorite, either Halloween costume or piece of clothing or whatever of kids for decades, which is a pretty big accomplishment. But it's actually mobile game stuff that's starting to, kind of make its way into popular culture or mass consciousness, stuff like Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, to a lesser extent, even Temple Run to some extent. If you go to the toy section now at Target and you look at all the board games and stuff like that, you will start to see, games that appeared on the iPhone. And stuff that appeared on Facebook or in a browser window at first.
Watch the NFL any Sunday. Camera angles. There's camera angles that came straight out of Madden. They didn't exist in television coverage of football until John Madden Football did them. They were borrowed and adapted. Watch the replays and watch when they highlight players and they put the little circles around them and stuff like that. Video games influence how professional football is broadcast and covered. Nowadays, movie producers, television producers, they're the first generations that grew up gaming. And you see that influence in what they do. Everyone can understand when you say, okay, there's a certain song. Everyone has that song that is an influence to them. It inspired them in some way, or they connected to that song in some way. Everyone has a movie that they connect to in some way. Maybe you're blue and you watch that movie to feel better, or that movie reminds you of a time. Everyone has that, or a sports hero influenced you to do something. Now we're in generations where people that grew up video games, and those video games impacted their lives in ways that influenced the person they became.
It's how we think about entertainment. It's how we think about, having fun. It's how we think about interacting with other people. And because games in the end are play, and play is a way to learn. I think that you're going to see gaming integrated into more aspects of real life through, what we could now call gamification, but it's really just play and learning.
I mean, if you have a lot of co-op games, for example, you're introducing people that are having to work in teams, having to interact with each other, and then you're having like a lot of children, for example, are learning through educational games sometimes in settings that they cannot get in a school. So I think there's a lot of potential in games. It's not just entertainment. It can be both a cathartic experience, for example, or educational experience, or just general team building, personal relief, whatnot.
The impact of that, I think, is really important because I see games as a positive thing. I like the idea that games provide agency. And I know that's a weird word to use, but I think I like it that my son plays games rather than watches TV, because in a game he has to use his brain. He has to figure things out. And also it teaches him, if I work at it and I learn things and I practice, I can get good at something. and that I have power in this game world. It teaches him, like, if I do these things and I apply myself, I can get somewhere in the real world too. And I think that is just a huge thing that I think games can provide.
Where I really am excited is to see more that sense of place, that sense of sort of what I like to call the existential prerogative inside of games, where you start to make moral decisions and you start to see the ramifications. If that can be put onto a larger scale, you can start to look at games as the safe place to have adult discussions. Games have to start addressing larger social concerns. And that does not have to mean it occurs at the expense of fun. But it needs to stop being sort of a juvenile discussion happening over there when the rest of the world is over here having their discussions in books and films, in music and art and all those other forms. That it will become so important, for games to be regarded the right way and to find their footing going forward, and also allowing us to realize challenge is not a requisite for every single game. That you can put more of the onus on a sense of experience and coming out of it changed, being absorbed in something.
The next big step, I think, is to help force society, I think, to break free of that conversation and understanding of games as entirely one thing, because I think there still is an understanding of whether video games are good or not. I think still a lot of the vocabulary, especially coming from the content creators and holders, the developers and the publishers, is aimed at that core market of gamers. And so it's still kind of a clubhouse that we keep putting the sign on that says, keep out.
Even though we are legitimately, no lie, bigger than Hollywood and bigger than the music industry for that matter, we're a $100 billion business, and yet so many of us still wish we were making movies or are trying to make cinematic games instead of embracing what makes us unique. I think that's holding us back as a medium, and also kind of ensuring that we stay relevant to a core audience.
I think the most important thing for fans of the medium, fans of video games in general, is to not pass judgment on each other or feel that like one form of video game is inherently better than the other or more special or whatever it may be. There's value in almost all video games to someone, and the problem that I feel that we have within the industry is people fanboying so hard with what they know and love that they don't have an appreciation of what else someone else loves. I want to experience as much as it is possible. There are certain types of video games that I'm just not into, but I love it all. I think that there's value in that kind of mindset. If it's going to be taken seriously, we need to not be so closed-minded and introverted in the things that we're into.
Communities are a really, really hard thing to manage. In fact, I don't know that you really can manage them. It's more a question of kind of herding cattle, trying to get everybody moving in the same direction at once. Unfortunately, communities are typically identified by the worst elements. So you may have a community of 1,000 people and 990 of them are actually great, reasonable, very intelligent people, but 10 bad apples can absolutely spoil the bunch. And so I think it is absolutely incumbent upon all of the members of the community to do the best that they can, but really there's only so much they can do. People are going to be people, and that's the freedom of the internet is an amazing thing. Unfortunately, it brings with it a couple things that are not necessarily as enjoyable.
At the end of the day, I think that the internet, we tend to amplify slights, misunderstandings. Oh God, they know nothing about games. Yes. And your parents will always find you to be a little bit strange and won't understand what you're doing in the evening. That is just kind of a facet of life. And I think that we need to find a sense of self-importance that isn't based upon opposition, but based upon some sense of celebration of what's really happening creatively within the game industry.
I definitely see it being embraced more as not like this deviant in entertainment. Before, it's like, oh, this person plays games, that's really strange. You're not getting that anymore because there's so much more exposure with like PAX, with GDC, and just general exposure has helped a lot, I think.
For example, coverage of video games has somewhat matured. It's being covered in more mainstream press. In a deeper way, it's not always the superficial conversation of whether video games are good or not. You're seeing more in-depth conversation and discussion happening in the public space about it.
And the EU is looking at like regulating free-to-play stuff right now and putting it in like some corner with gambling laws, which is interesting because that will get rid of some of the horrible stuff we have going on. And other than that, hopefully, I don't know, I'm quite optimistic about that stuff. I just hope people start making games that are more diverse, because right now we're wasting a lot of time on a very specific set of people who have a very specific set of what they want games to be. And I hope that gets wider and more interesting.
That sells and stows violence against its own people through vicious, violent video games.
These young kids want to dress like the actors they see in TV or what they see in these video games, and they arm themselves with these rifles and guns, and they go out and they commit these killings. It is sick, and it's a cocaine. Our entire nation has become addicted to violence for entertainment, like the Romans.
What is it called? Art of War, Man of War? What do the kids play? We don't allow that in our house. Really? So busy buying Call of Duty. There needs to be more hugs in households.
Those aren't mutually exclusive. Well, nothing in Call of Duty says you can't hug your family.
Well, you know what?
So the anxiety that surrounds video games, and I'm not saying that there isn't a decent discussion to be had about violence in games or violence in any media. I completely disallow the idea that because of the interactivity of the game that somehow there's something more pernicious about violence in games than in any other form. That is not to say that the kind of lurid obsession that games have with violence is not something that we should at least take a step back and wonder why it's so damn appealing, and if there should be some responsibility taken to not make that the steady diet of the average gamer.
I think that we shouldn't feel defensive. We need to understand these things. We need to understand if they're actually detrimental, and we need to adjust for that, right? We need to create our medium in a way that is positive. And does that mean we should remove all violence from games? Absolutely not. There are plenty of great films, great television, great music, great art, right, that involves violence, because violence is part of the human experience. But to use it haphazardly without understanding its consequences is on us. On the other hand, is it our fault that people have used it as a boogeyman, have used it as a scapegoat for years? No, I think that that's something that has to change, and that we're working to change as an industry. And I think there's a conversation to be had as a nation.
A lot of the video game community just kind of came out of this era recently, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you had a whole lot of people saying that video games were going to turn children into killers, right? And so the typical response of the video game community was, no, the video game's not going to change how you act, you know, in real life. At the same time, you know, it is kind of important to look at the content of games and think to ourselves, like, you know, is this the kind of content that we want in video games? And if not, you know, what is it? What are we going to do to change it? So now it's just sort of coming back around to the idea that we can say, yeah, like the media that we consume does kind of, you know, affect what we do, but we really don't know how. And we can say that without, you know, also admitting the point that if you play a shooter, you are going to go shoot up your school, which we know is just simply not true.
You know, it's funny. A lot of people think we need to defend ourselves against Congress and against, you know, people who say we're murder simulators, we're teaching kids to kill. I don't worry about that too much, honestly. I don't worry about it for a variety of reasons. First of all, more women play games now than men, and more men now play games than kids. And those men and women typically grew up playing games. They know there's no particular danger in games. I think the best you can say about the existing research is some games affect some people in some ways at some times under certain circumstances, you know?
You know, it's hard. I look at it a lot and like, do I think some games should be as violent as they should be? No. Do I think that every woman in a video game should have 42 triple F breasts? No, I don't think that's right either. But to say that there shouldn't be violent games, I think it's all about free speech in the end.
My feeling these days is methinks he doth protest too much. The Supreme Court has, in probably some of the most unequivocal terms, stated that it is free speech. Games are free speech, and you cannot abridge the expression that comes from games any more than you can the media or any other form of art. We've put the baby to rest. And yes, there are things that erupt in state houses all across the country, and we all know it has less to do with the practical application of the law than to suddenly just kind of strike a blow for some type of, you know, cultural goodness to then curry a few votes and get your name in the paper.
I think like any medium, you know, the medium often gets blamed for problems that occur in society. People want to point to something other than individual responsibility for people doing certain things, you know, antisocial or self-destructive actions. You know, a certain amount of the population is going to be involved in antisocial and destructive actions, and it's more convenient to blame the tool or some environmental issue than say, okay, did that person have a choice? I think if you go out and kill people, you have some kind of problem, a real serious problem, and regardless of whether you were involved in gaming or involved in, you know, tens of other things that people blame stuff on, you know, you were going to find a way to get into some trouble. So I think that it's natural for us to deflect blame onto inanimate things rather than take blame as humans.
I actually think that responding to a lot of these is not valuable. There's still going to be bad reporting and bad understanding of games. So that happens for a lot of other types of cultures as well. That, you know, we posit so much value on the mainstream media for legitimacy that is really to our own detriment that we do that. Just ignore it. It's not going to go away.
There's always going to be some sort of piece of content that's going to get a rise out of the public. You know, even after comic books were the evil thing, and after rock and roll was the evil thing, and after movies, you know, were the evil thing. Natural born killers, you know, movies had stopped being controversial for a long time, but then there's always one that finds its way. Right now, video games are controversial because there are people that want to stir up controversy, right? They want to find a reason. They want to find a cause. They want to blame something. And over the years, we've seen it for jazz, for like I said, comic books and rock and roll. Now it's video games. That will quiet down. That will subside. People will realize that it's a ridiculous argument, and they'll move on to something else. There'll be something new in 15, 20 years that will be the new controversy that's ruining our kids' lives and causing them to be delinquents. And later on, we're going to find out that it actually inspired those children to do great things. It inspired them to create art. It inspired them to create content, or inspired them to do whatever it is that they want to do, because we draw from those influences. So is it going to be around? Sure. But is it real? Nah.
I would imagine that those problems will always be with us in the same way that they're with every medium, but they will be less severe, and they'll be less something that is like the main talking point. Just in terms of video game addiction, you know, I don't know if that's necessarily like the problem, but the relationship that we have to these things, I think it's definitely something that we should be talking about as a culture and then as developers and thinking about, in the way that like Jonathan Blow, once described, some game experiences being like fast food. And I think that's totally accurate, that there are things that we consume that, whether it's like in the same way that we consume a hamburger, that we're making choices about it. And maybe we shouldn't be eating hamburgers all of the time, but, there are other things that we can find. And right now, there aren't a lot of games that are made that aren't hamburgers. So as developers, that's definitely, our challenge for the future.
Nothing should be to extremes. Even my son, so I'm a game maker, and I put controls on my son as to how much he can play games. Now, someone could like, why would you do that? It's sort of hypocritical. I'm like, no, it would be the same thing. I don't let him eat 47 chocolate chip cookies every day, and they're not illegal, right? So, a lot of times, that's really what it is. And I think ultimately, and this is what I hope where society gets to, is society gets to the point where they understand video games and gaming in general, it's just a part of what we do. And it, like everything else, has to be done in moderation.
I also say that addiction is just doing too much of something to your own detriment, and that games are no more addictive than gambling, that are no more addictive than drinking and drug taking, that, even someone who reads too many books, one could say, hey, you might want to chill out and get a little more variety in your life. I think, though, that why there seems to, when we have these debates right now, why they're only particular to games, has to do more with language. That if you look at opera, the Vatican got very worried about the popularity of opera. It was completely secular and people were flocking there. And they said, hold on a second, we're losing some power. It's a new, I'm saying it's a new language. And whenever there's a new language that's been introduced, those who are not part of it realize that discussions are happening. A power center exists that they don't have access to because they don't possess the vernacular or, in some other cases, the language. And that's where you start to see the tension. That's why it tends to be generational. You suddenly look at someone listening to that rock music because it doesn't make any sense to you, but that means something to someone else. You do lose power, and it creates a social anxiety. And I think that's why we have these eruptions. I never believe that these debates and these problems people have with video games are the violence or the addiction per se, but those are the easy things to kind of latch onto to really explicate that sense of uncertainty and anxiety that those who are playing games feel.
Like if you hear someone talking about video games on the news, there's a very good chance, unfortunately, that it's about violence or addiction or some really negative quality to it. And I think part of that is that there just aren't a lot of people out there that have had really positive experiences in their life with video games, and so they naturally tend towards more sensational, horrible parts of video games. Certainly, broadcasters, in major news outfits, have not had these, revelatory moments with games the way they probably have with movies and music.
To those who understand, no explanation is necessary. To those who don't, no explanation will ever do. And I think that's kind of a problem that video gaming has. I think people, if they're not able to grasp that idea of it, they're not going to. Some of that is how you come up too. Video games aren't the new thing anymore. Generations now, it's always been there. My kids clearly have grown up in a world. There's arcade games lined up on our wall. There's game consoles everywhere. They probably think that's normal. It doesn't have to be introduced to them later in life where their mind is already kind of wired to think one way. It's always been there. That's the biggest thing. I don't think enough people, I guess, are willing to try new things anymore in general, new experiences. And, video games, I wish more would, but we're not there.
There is still an entrenched group that is reactionary, as there always has been and always will be, and in some ways balances society, that decries this medium for its newness because they don't understand it and have not taken the time to try and understand it. But I think that's fading away. I think it's fading away year after year. Whether it's games showing up in the Smithsonian or the president appointing someone as an advisor on games, right? We are seeing this medium reach both national legitimacy. We get closer to realizing this ideal of games being more than just a children's pastime. It's also important to recognize that being a children's pastime is not a bad thing. In fact, there's high value to that. I would never want to remove the type of games that we all grew up loving. At the same time, we're finally getting to realize that potential of doing something more.
I think that games are probably going to surprise all of us in the way that, no one saw Minecraft, coming out of nowhere and being something that becomes so important for so many people, especially kids, that, something that, in a lot of ways is like replace Legos, and that in the future I'm really excited to see more voices, coming from more places that, are part of that discussion of what games are and, what kinds of experiences we as players, can participate in.
It's going to go in many different directions. I don't think I would have ever expected the explosion of mobile. I don't think I anticipated the interest in the indie game scene happening so quickly and so readily. And also I think the quality of the games really kind of, underwriting all of what that interest was. It's hard to anticipate. The one thing is, as much creativity goes into games, it is so beholden to technology. That technology has to be ever increasing, but it has to be understood and it has to be exploited in a way that isn't going to become so expensive and require so many people that it becomes absolutely impossible. I would like to think that this will allow us to turn a little bit more inwards and realize that the bigger, the flashier, and the better doesn't necessarily have to be the best direction that the industry wants to go in.
The future of games is completely unknowable, and that's, if even more than anything else, the fact that the future is unknowable is the most exciting thing happening in games. I mean, everything is happening in games right now. There are little indie games, there are big budget AAA blockbusters, there are mobile apps, there are social games. And when nobody knows what the future is, that means one critical thing, and that is creativity trumps cash. The folks at Electronic Arts and Zynga and Disney and Ubisoft and Activision, they have no idea what the future of gaming is going to be any more than the folks in the indie scene. No one knows. And what that means is everybody has to try everything, and we'll eventually see what succeeds and what doesn't. And I think that variety of development models and that the variety of distribution models and that variety of content is going to secure our future.
I think it's very fun to watch things that, even as somebody who tries to observe the video game industry 24/7, to see stuff off my radar come onto my radar is fun, because it's showing that the world of video games is so much bigger than any one person can really kind of keep track of. And that part I think is just hilarious and fun.
As time goes on, just more and more and more of us are gamers. There's more people, and also it goes back to access, is that there is no specialized access needed for games anymore. Everyone has games on their phone, everyone has games on their TV, everyone has on their cable box, it has games. And I think that's what really makes it games pervasive. And as us old guys get to be more and more of the decision makers or the people making policy, and then the next generation comes up, games will be something that people do.
The reality is that most people engage with games right now on their phone. And so making, I think, deeper content, richer content available in that medium would help bridge the gap between the average person and their understanding of games as a very casual, superficial activity, and sort of bringing them into understanding that games are capable of much more and expressing much more. And then that's really cool, and we should be doing that more.
I believe the sooner that everyone kind of embraces video games for what they are, is that they're video games, and they do have an intrinsic artistic value, the better off we're going to be, as a society, as fans of video games.
The fact that we're moving beyond that means that our cultural reach is going to expand, our aesthetic boundaries are going to be destroyed, and eventually we are going to be truly mainstream, and not just in terms of the revenue we generate, but in terms of our cultural impact and our place in among the arts.